Hey, the NBA.com. This is John. This report is for the 9th of June. We had our slight retrace back up into the big drop. Typically for a big move, you look for a third to a half move back inside the larger candle. This was only a little about the third situation, and we're getting a little bit more of an improvement here today. So yesterday, barely even got back into the main body of it. And the difference we see here from a MBI reading, at least, we already had the magenta underneath from way back last week, and you still had weak short interest. Now, for the first time, you actually have MBI white leading magenta, so that changes the dynamic quite a bit. And now we have steel over red in this particular case, coming from below, which has always been the saving grace within any soft readings that we got back here with the MBI, because we knew we had a full steel reset. Well, that's now changed. You see the difference. It's subtle, but it still makes a difference. Um, it doesn't mean can't turn things around. It just means short-term buyers are the only ones keeping this particularly afloat. So the critical question then becomes, at what point do we see this separation between cyan and green continue to expand or start to contract? If it contracts, you're going to get, your rise. You would expect at that point orange to continue to dive, pivot back up of the DOC orange. Would that be good? At least from a long standpoint view. We look at it from the 50K standpoint, still from the broader short, there's barely a move back up in the 50% range, declining 50%, no less. And, it was pretty soft, and then we ended up with weakness later part of the day. And it was pretty clear from that standpoint. From a 5K, it started early with these little punch steps, and then we started to see some softening, and that was sort of the clue early on. And then, of course, they bought that back up slightly again, but that's when things started to get a little bit soft overall. And still volume. Look at that; it was quite a range going through. But then you ended up with the cascade, just the opposite direction, filling things back in, and then we get to our pre-market, lifting it all the way back up to the previous range. Middle tone, I would call it, range. But what was interesting too about this is that you get some of these. I don't call them necessarily false buy signals, but they're brief buy signals, and it's usually where your orange dips below the green here on the DOC, and you would say, okay, that's typically a long, and in fact, it reflected it. So at that point, and then literally, you'd be looking at a situation where you're looking for orange popping up over green, and then you've got to see some kind of positive move. In this case, you had MBI white spikes, so the expectation was at some point here you're going to get a move back to zero. Though it held up quite a long time, but time is irrelevant from that standpoint. It's just pre-letting you know that there just isn't going to be the straight down unless you can force a short cover. But you would expect to see a situation like this where you end up with the magenta well over the red line 45 range and clearly above 33, and then usually it goes across. And that's what we were seeing from the daily that lasted quite a while. But what I typically look for in these particular cases is you'll notice the shakeout, these dips where we go into the deep red. And what I look at is the uh, shakeout yellow line. I wait for a pivot up from that, because if you're in a decline, that's typically one of those where you're already under the 23%. And that helps you avoid the noise, because you can get a lot of dips in these mid ranges and stuff. But unless your shakeout is already positive and you see the upswing from the shakeout yellow, uh, it just lets you know that you're still in a soft spot. From that standpoint, it doesn't mean it's wrong, as long as you're nimble with these kinds of trades, because it could last a bar, two, maybe three at the most, and then they just turn around and flip. In this particular case, you get a double whammy, because you got the orange dip below, which came off this big huge candle, but under MBI white leading. Well, with the MBI white leading, there's not much you can do. Now that clears itself once it gets above the 33, but in this particular case, you ended up with the move above the 33 at a time when you started to get you already had peak DOC steel in that, and then you already get the crossover literally for the next bar. And then, but that made the higher P2 pivot, so you have a red DOC pivot here, and then another one right there. That made this turnaround a much stronger buy. Now, depending on your stop range, it would not have mattered had you entered in either one of those. You'd be in the exact same spot, and that happens a lot. It just these are the testing phase to try and see if they can get weak hands to exit, and if they don't, there just isn't the liquidity that they're looking for to dump into. So that leads to the turnaround. And that gives them an idea how much they can absorb as far as contract wise. You reach a point where there just aren't any sellers on the dip, then yeah, it goes pretty fast because there just isn't enough, particularly in soft overnight Asian session. And then you can see how weak that volume is from overseas, and even here in the early EU session is pretty much right about from here up. So not a huge move from that aspect. If we start to take a look at some of the other details, Bitcoin, yeah, brief move, but you can see it's just about having Magenta take over, but that's got to get over the 25. That could be a little bit of a spurt. Nothing dramatic, so to speak, from a gold standpoint. Still going to continue to base, and they're going to keep it there until you start seeing the CPI numbers, and that's going to be an ugly configuration. Euro popping back up off of the bigger decline, but broadly, we already know what does the euro have to offer at this particular stage. All you can hope for is the U.S. doing worse, which it's not much of a metric, especially given the fact that the U.S. has a broad energy spectrum that just doesn't exist from the EU standpoint. Oil softening just a little bit because now you're into this malaise of nothing's getting decided and it's just extending, but commerce just isn't moving. And broadly, that's just going to impact the Europeans more than the U.S. at this particular stage. We look at the daily for the NQ. You can notice the difference here. It's much stronger. You don't have the MBI white crossover from there. So there's your tech basically being the support at this particular stage for where the market's at and sustaining things. So interesting to see. But anything relevant, I will certainly put on the team chat. As always, have a good one. Trade well.